Hey everybody, before we get started, a word from our friends at Virginia Theological Seminary. Clarify your focus, sharpen your skills, intensify your ministry with a Doctor of Ministry from VTS. As the largest Episcopal seminary in the United States, VTS offers an unparalleled, flexible DMin program that will introduce you to the latest in congregational development and educational research. You can check them out at vts.edu or on Facebook. Are you headed to the Wild Goose Festival? Thousands of campers are headed to the beautiful hills of North Carolina June 21st through 24th. Wild Goose is a festival at the intersection of justice, spirituality, and art. Some of this year's guests are Jim Wallace, Brian McLaren, and Shane Claiborne. ChurchNext is a proud sponsor. Find out more at www.wildgoosefestival.org. Here's your program. Hi everybody, I'm Chris Yaw. Welcome to ChurchNext, and you're tuned to a place where people who are passionate about healthy congregations come to hear from the very best mentors around. My next guest is doing just this, helping us build healthy congregations through his writing, through his speaking, and through his leadership in the Presbyterian Church. His name is Landon Whitsitt, and he's the vice moderator of the General Assembly, a popular keynote speaker, and a writer whose book you may have read is called Open Source Church, and it helps us rethink congregational frameworks. And Landon, thanks so much for joining me on Church Next. And let's start right there. Can you tell us a bit about the vitality and the energy that gets unleashed as you envision an open source church?
That is really the whole impetus behind the work that I did on Open Source Church, the idea that I tried to put into place. My contention is that churches do make a very common but very fatal mistake, and that's that they rely solely on one person, and it's usually the pastor. They rely solely on one person to have the answers that they're going to need in order to live into the call and the mission that God has given them. And my contention is that if we start to understand ourselves in a more, what I refer to as an open source way, what happens is that everybody gets to take ownership of that mission. Everybody gets to take ownership of the ministry, and those things that each of us have latent in our hearts that God has put in us. Really gets a chance to seep out. It takes a little while because people are just not used to being in control of their own mission and ministry, honestly. But once they do, they really take hold of it and really run with it.
You know, Landon, that's the first thing that came to my mind as you began to answer that question, is that, you know, so many of our traditional churches, we've relied on Papa Priest. We've relied on them to do, to clean the gutters, to show up at every meeting. And that's part of the DNA of a lot of our congregations. How do you begin to say, it's like saying somebody's never been given a driver's license, here's the wheel.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, it is in our DNA. I think that Dr. Martin Luther King was wrong in one respect, and that's that the church is the taillights of the culture. We always seem to follow everybody. We always seem to go with what everybody else is doing. And one of the things that we ape really well, is our understanding of the business literature probably about 20 or 25 years ago. And we understand that there is one person that needs to be in charge, and the buck stops with that person, and we all need to work for whatever that person wants. It's going to take a long time for us to reframe our thinking. In the book, I talk about when Moses led the people out of Israel, and there in the book of Exodus, Moses has a conversation with his father-in-law Jethro, and Jethro basically points out, "Do you realize what's happening? They've replaced Pharaoh with you." They think that simply because you're a nice guy that everything is going to be okay, but I'm telling you, this is going to be bad for you and it's going to be bad for them. This is a problem that the people of God have had in their understanding of working out the mission of God, I think, since the inception.
But yet at the same time, the idea that God has gifted some people with some really clear leadership gifts, he has to be taken into consideration too.
Yeah, it is a fine dance that we need to dance. One of the things that I love about the denomination that I'm part of, Presbyterian Church, and I've only been a Presbyterian for maybe a dozen years. I grew up in congregational, non-denominational, fundamentalist kinds of churches. One of the things that I love about the Presbyterian Church is when we talk about leadership, we say that God calls a whole people first, and then out of that people, God pulls specific kinds of people to be set apart. We use the language set apart, not set above. So there are some of us, and I'm one of these people, who God has called and set apart and trained to be teachers. There are some that God has called and set apart to be what we call our ruling elders, the people who are actually responsible for running the church. God has called and set apart deacons in our tradition. Those are the people who do the ministry of care and compassion. So yeah, there are leadership things, but in our understanding, and I tell Presbyterians, when I talk to them all the time about this, I said, I'm not saying anything that you don't already know. There is leadership, but it is a leadership it's a leadership of service rather than what I call top-down command and control.
Mm-hmm. Well, then, is leadership something that's a gift then, Landon, or can anybody do it?
I firmly believe that leadership can be learned. I absolutely believe that. There are certain roles that we need to play. Not everybody is gifted to be what we call a teaching elder. Not everybody has those kinds of gifts. I know that when I look at the deacons in our congregations, there is no way God's ever going to call me to that. I just do not have those kinds of gifts and skills. I like to tell people I have a shirt that says, I hate people. I'm not going to be a deacon. That's not the way that I work. But aside from those natural kinds of giftings, natural kinds of proclivities, leadership is something that can be learned. We can, because all leadership is, I contend, all leadership is service. That's all it is. And it doesn't take that much to learn how to serve people well and enable to them to get their jobs done.
Okay. So then we begin talking open source, which is really, when I think about that term, Landon, I think about younger people and certainly the technological derivation of that word. And so what are we talking about in terms of applying that to a congregation?
Yes, the term open source does come from the software movement. I like to tell folks that I am two things. I am one, a church geek, and I am two, a software geek. And those things have to go together. They have to mesh. And a lot of the work that I've done has really just been a fun mental experiment for me, trying to ask the question, is there anything that we can learn between these two disciplines? Open source is short for open source code, and source code in the software world is very simply the instructions that a program uses to tell a computer how to run it. That's all it is. It's just instructions. There are two kinds of code. There's open code and there's closed code. Closed code means that only a few people get to look at it, get to have access to it, get to edit it, get to say what it does. On the contrast, open source code means that anybody can look at it, anybody has access to it, and if they know how to write code, they can edit it. And so I say I don't think it's that hard to take a leap into church. I've been to some churches that I think are very closed churches. Only a few people know what my friend Carol Howard Merritt calls the unwritten rules of church. Only a few people know those. Only a few people have the right and responsibility to change them, as opposed to the open source church where pretty much everybody can have access to those things, and it's a setup where it not only encourages but it invites people into that process of reframing what this church might look like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what might that church look like? I mean, as you apply open source thinking to church boards, church governance, I mean, you came out of a non-denominational, very free background to a traditional denomination that's actually isn't Presbyterian. Isn't that a Scottish word for committee? I mean, I mean, you couldn't get into much more of a, structure than that.
I don't know, Chris. I'm going to have to form a committee to answer that question for you. You would think so. You would think that moving from the non-denominational world into the traditional mainline world would be a shift in that way of much more stricture. But I've actually found it to be quite the opposite, because in the non-denominational world, there's a phrase that is liked to be used, no creed but Christ. There's no constitution that's written down. There's no laws that are written down. There's no bylaws. It's just we're all trying to serve Jesus. What happens is that usually one charismatic guy, and it's usually a guy, ends up ruling the roost. And it reflects that moral, ethical stage of development that I like to call might makes right. They are the ones in control, and they are going to be the ones to say how it runs, as opposed to the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church rose at the same time, and a lot of our mainline churches rose at the same time that the United States kind of rose into its understanding and its identity. The Presbyterian Church in specific operates in a lot the same way democratically. We have I like to call a representative democracy in the Presbyterian Church. Everybody gets a voice or has the opportunity to get a voice. It's actually much easier to be involved, I think, in a traditional mainline church than it is in a non-denominational church.
I think what you're suggesting is, if as I'm drawing the analogy over to computer code, is there are even certain frameworks and definitions and parameters that one needs to abide by in order for the code to make sense. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to tell people all the time, open source doesn't mean anarchy. It doesn't mean anything goes. It means that a lot more things go than what previously had gone. One of the thought experiments I do in the book is to look at the community that is Wikipedia, the Wikipedia community that is building this online encyclopedia, and ask if there's anything about that community that could teach something to the churches. And one of the main things that Wikipedia is very clear about is that they are an encyclopedia, and they state this in their 5 foundational principles. The number one thing is, we are an encyclopedia. And they don't stop there. They don't just say, here's what we are. They say, here's what we're not. And I think that a lot of churches suffer from not even knowing what their purpose is. But I tell people, before we answer any of these other questions that are fun, like, how do we get the young people to come back to our church, or et cetera, the very first question that has to be asked is, do we understand, do we think we even have an inkling of why God has called this particular group of women and men together in this place at this time? And I tell them, I'm not asking you to rewrite your mission statement, but if your mission statement looks like the mission statement of every other church, I think you should probably scrap it and start over, because God has called you very specifically to do something.
Mm-hmm. Well, just as Wikipedia says, well, we're an encyclopedia, and I haven't looked at their definition as you have, I would guess there's some way they define an encyclopedia.
Absolutely.
And so when we say, well, it's easy, we're a church, you really, challenge us to ask the important question, what is a church?
Right.
Because as I look at the little knowledge I have, especially compared to you, moving around the churches, you kind of see how different groups of believers would define what a church is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fun to have this. Do this experiment with folks. I'll tell them a little bit about Wikipedia and then ask them to get together and say, do you know, or do you have an idea of what the purpose of church is, even generally? It's all very generic things. And I think it's just because we've not put a whole lot of thought. I don't fault people for that.
Right.
We just don't put a whole lot of thought into it. But church is not this big monolithic thing. The church that I serve here in Liberty, Missouri is going to be a very specific thing, as opposed to the church that you are a part of in Detroit. There are necessarily going to be differences, and we have to be able to name those things. And so again, it's not anarchy, it's not anything goes, because your context is going to dictate the mission that God has called you to do.
And I've heard it said, and I'd be curious about your thoughts about this, Landon, that really the job of church leaders is to continually ask that question, who are we and what are we called to do?
I think so. I don't know what else a church leader can do. I'm kind of famous in my small group of friends for saying that I hate church consultants, because I think that pastors and church leaders should be doing those sorts of functions for their congregations. If you've got to hire somebody to come in from the outside and ask you to take a look at your own watch and tell you what time it is, I think that's kind of ridiculous. I think that the church leaders, the church pastors specifically, should be the ones that are constantly putting that in front of the congregational leadership and forcing them to wrestle with these questions.
But the boom in the church consultant, field kind of betrays a few things about certainly our self-understanding, as you allude to, but certainly the fear that people have. The consultant is what? Just anybody who comes from 50 miles away or more.
Right.
Is that so often we just want to hear it from a different voice?
I think so. One of the things that I play on in the book is that the world is changing radically right now. It is not, and I'm not saying anything that no one else has said, and certainly no one else on ChurchNext has not said. The world is changing radically. And we just don't know what to do. One of the things that, I try to be gracious as much as I can to congregation members. And, these are folks who spend the majority of their life doing something else. And so they don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about church. And so when it comes down to the fact that the institution, as they've understood it, no longer functions the way that it has, they're understandably going to look to somebody else and say, does someone else have the answer? I maintain that that's a mistake, but I understand why folks do it. And yeah, I think that's exactly why the church consultant boom has been happening, because people just want to feel better. They want to blunt this pain of not knowing what to do.
Yeah. And but there are really some great advantages to going through this incredible time of transition, aren't there, Landon? I would imagine as you pastor your church and as you move around and speak at conferences and other places, that you probably see some really cool things going on. And I want to get a chance to ask you that question. What do you observe as the bright spots?
Yeah, I fully agree with your contention that this time is unleashing a lot of creativity for us, because it is forcing us to go back to some of our foundational understandings. When I travel around as the vice moderator of the Presbyterian Church, people always ask, what are you seeing around the church? And the thing that I say, I usually say two things. One, there are good Christian people all over the place that just want to serve Jesus. I mean, that is, I don't know any other way to say it than that. We have to stop vilifying one another. We have to stop thinking bad things about each other, because I've seen a lot of different kinds of people, and every single one of those groups just want to do the best they can to serve Jesus and make sure that God's mission is accomplished in the little slice of God's kingdom that they've been given. The second thing that I like to say is that nobody's got their head in the sand anymore. Everybody gets that this thing it has changed. They may not know what to do about it, but a lot of people are asking some amazing questions. And we've reached a time now where we've been asking those questions long enough that I think we've started to see some really good answers. I don't know if they're going to be the long-term answers, but people are now starting to give some answers. One of my favorite stories is from a little church in Dahlonega, Georgia. Dahlonega Presbyterian Church up in the mountains of northeast Georgia. This is a little church. When I was there the Sunday to preach with them, they actually welcomed in some new members. They are now 37 members rather than 35 members. So talk about some church growth. That's
a good 6%. That's healthy.
Yeah. I mean, hey, I wish I could see 6% in a church. One of the things that Dahlonega Presbyterian Church has done is, and this seems odd to think about at first, but when I started really reflecting on it, it started to seem very, very meaningful. Dahlonaga's pianist retired about 2 years ago. They lost their pianist. And as a result, they've been searching for some church musicians. Now, the typical playbook of a Presbyterian church says you go out and you get someone who can play both the piano and the organ and can play the old hymns and possibly lead a choir if you've got the choir. That's just the way that you do things. That's what it means to be Presbyterian. But the good folks at Dahlonega Presbyterian Church realize that they are in an area of their state that is noted for bluegrass musicians. And so what they have done is they have contracted with a husband and wife team who are some amazing bluegrass musicians to come in and to lead their music during worship. Now one wouldn't think that this is anything to scream about, but I know these little churches, and these little churches by and large are very fearful about the life of their congregation. They're very fearful that they're going to lose their identity and lose their vitality. And for them to do something as radical, and honest, for them it was radical, for them to do something as radical as stop having a pianist and start having a guy playing a banjo says something to me about the way that congregations are starting to look at their mission. They're starting to live into the place where they are at. It reminds me of what Jeremiah was telling the exiles to do when they finally got to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens, eat what they produce. Live in the place in which you find yourself. Work for that place. Be a part of that community. One of the things that's exciting, I could give you a lot of different examples, but they all kind of fall under this umbrella of churches are starting to discover they live in a particular context, and that means that they're going to have to do ministry in a particular way. I think it's going to be a long time again, if ever, that you can walk from a Presbyterian church in Kansas City to a Presbyterian church, say, in Detroit and experience the same thing, because we're going to start to understand that we are different kinds of people, and we're going to live out the ministry and mission that Christ has given us in different ways. That to me is the big bright spot as I go around the country.
Okay, and you're also the pastor of a church, right?
Actually, I misspoke. I was the pastor of the church until last summer. I actually work for a mid-level of our denomination. My friends laugh at me because I'm now a bureaucrat. I'm a company man. I am the proverbial suit. So,
but you worked in a congregation for several years, and
yeah.
I'm curious as to how you began to put open source thinking into practice in your own situation.
Yeah, the open source idea was actually born from two different perspectives. One was the conflation of my software and churchy geekiness, and the other side was a conversation that I had, a very intense conversation with my personnel committee for about 2.5 years over what my role was with the life of the community. I am a part of a certain cohort of pastors. We all graduated from seminary around the same time. I know Methodists and Disciples and Episcopals that all feel this way. I'm a part of a particular cohort where we don't understand ourselves as the local resident church expert. We don't think we've been trained to do that, and we're very aware of who we are, and we know that we're not gifted in doing those things. Just because I give a good sermon doesn't mean that I can administrate a budget worth anything. So I was having a very intense conversation with my personnel committee over this idea of the fact that I was being expected really to run the church, and from my perspective, particularly in the Presbyterian church, that's not the way we're set up. That's not the way it's supposed to go. But tradition is bucking what we say that our structure is. And so I started to do little things. I started to have these conversations about the reality that God calls the whole people. I started introducing these ideas. I never really used the terms open source with them because I think they would have just shut me down. Not a lot of them really care about software geeky stuff. But I talked about things like about how all of their leadership are the shepherds of the congregation. I would do fun things like I would preach on the passage in Acts where Paul calls together the Ephesian elders and says, "Okay, I'm leaving and going to Jerusalem. Your job is to take care of these people." And the day that was the text for worship, I told my liturgist I was going to show up a half an hour late just to prove to them they didn't need me. They could go ahead and do these things. Those are the kinds of things that I would do. I would do things like be in church committees of our church board, and the elder who happened to be the moderator of that committee would look at me and say, "Pastor, would you like to pray?" And I'd say, "No, it's not my committee. You go ahead and pray. This is your meeting. You go ahead and pray." Now, they hated me for this.
Because they paid you well to be the professional prayer.
Exactly. Yeah, as they look at my resume, and I've honestly, on paper, I've done some pretty impressive stuff. I've been a part of a new church development geared towards young adults. I was the program director for an interreligious organization that administered a $500,000 budget and massive festival every year. I've gone to one of the best theological seminaries, not only in North America, but in the world. Yeah, I mean, on paper, I'm the guy that's supposed to know the answers. And so they're really mad because, yes, that's exactly right. We pay you to do this. And I kept saying, much what you were saying just a while ago, no, my job is to continually push these questions in front of your face because this is your church. And something that I don't know why I started, but I think I lucked into it pretty well. As soon as I got to the congregation, I started talking about leaving. And I would tell them, I'm only here for a season. This is not my church. This is your church. God has only called me to be with you for a season. And so I think one of the things, and it was a dumb luck kind of thing, that I started building into the expectation that they were the ones responsible for this congregation, not me. A lot of churches, a lot of congregations and denominations do it differently, but at least in the Presbyterian church, I'm not a member of the congregation. I'm a member of what we call the presbytery. So I'm not tied to that in the same way that they are. My job is to help them do the mission and ministry that God has called them to.
And, I think I've heard it said before, Landon, that it takes a good 10 years to turn the ship. Of faithful service, of faithful, reminding of these concepts that you're giving. And with the average minister in place for, 4 or 5 years now, that makes it really difficult. Because what you're talking about, I witness exactly what you're talking about in my own congregation. I've seen it play in other places. Because along with that often comes a sense of apathy. That are we really going to make a difference? And combating that as well seems to be an equal challenge.
Yeah. That's one of the main things that I discovered when I showed up at the congregation. I just stopped serving. There were two things. One I would name as apathy. The other one I would name as fear. Those were the predominant. I spent a good year and a half working with them in what I would refer to as a traditional interim pastor role of just helping them to realize that God has called them together for a particular purpose and for a particular reason. There must be a reason why God hasn't shut this thing down yet. There must be something for them to do, and yet helping them to get to get over the fear that they're not going to lose their church, they're not going to lose this thing that they love, but also light that little fire underneath them to try to combat some of that apathy. There were some people, I mean, as you well know, you know church people too. There were some people that are on fire from the moment they wake up in the morning. So trying to what I decided to do was I took a page out of Esom and Bandy's playbook, and I just started to fan the flames of those folks. I mean, I stopped worrying about the people who wanted me to, as Bandy says, clip their spiritual hangnails. I didn't want to do that anymore, so I stopped messing with it, and I just focused on the people who were excited about things. And just like a wildfire, it started to catch around because those folks started to do things, and then other people, well, they didn't want to feel left out, and they didn't want to feel like they weren't contributing. It was a pretty classic systems kind of reaction.
And often that's those are the new people who've got the energy, and sometimes the old guard isn't too happy about that because they begin to have an impact on the congregation.
Yeah, I actually read something or heard something. I need to go back and find it. Probably maybe 6 or 7 months ago. That it's not so much the age of a person that matters. It's how long they've been a part of that congregation. And what this person, they did some sort of study. I don't know the particulars, but what they were saying was if a person has been in a congregational context for at least 5 years, they have been fully, it's like I'm a Star Trek fan. They've become the Borg. They've been fully, taken over. They don't want to have anything new. So the constant challenge is to make sure that there are new people coming in that are challenging the expectations. And in fact, that's one of the things that I discovered with this congregation is there was this fight with, and it wasn't an explicit fight, but it was an implicit fight with the new folks who were coming in because it was very clear that those new ideas were going to change what their congregational context looked like, and a lot of folks just weren't having it. I can't blame them. I mean, they liked it. Church worked for them. It was fine. And it also does raise this other idea of do we want to displace the folks that are already in for the folks that we want to bring in? I've actually started to become an advocate for leaving churches alone. I don't like to talk about church transformation or redevelopment anymore. Yeah. I want to just leave those folks alone. Again, it comes from the open source idea of having a lot of variations and things. Let's leave those folks alone, and instead, I think that congregations can do this, but primarily like local judicatory bodies, presbyteries, dioceses, really need to start focusing on planting new churches. That's where a lot of my energy is in the life of the church today, because when I think of Mildred or Joe, who's been in that congregation for 30, 40, 50 years, and they've been handed something that has been great for them, and it has gotten them through the birth of their children and the death of their husband or wife, and it's gotten them through war, and it's gotten them through their anxiety and depression. Yeah, I don't know that I want to change that for them. I think I'd rather just leave them be. But the challenge is that you've got all these great, crazy ideas, and there's no place for these people to go, these new folks to go. That's really the problem as far as I can see.
And I was just going to start bringing that up. I mean, your friend Carol Howard Merritt talks a lot about what tribal church and what the church of the future and the church for young people is going to look like. And why don't we transition over there? Okay. What is the new church looking like?
There are a lot of different prototypes out there right now. I've got some relationship with folks, folks like Carol, who really I do not know how she does what she does. She's just absolutely amazing. When she talks about this intergenerational church, and when I go visit her in Washington D.C. and see the kind of context in which she works, it is truly amazing, and it is definitely a work of God. I also know relatively well a lot of people in the so-called emergent world. When I think about what is happening up in Minneapolis with Solomon's Porch, where Doug Padgett is the pastor. When I think about what's happening at House for All Sinners and Saints in Denver with Nadia Bowles-Weber. When I think about Covenant Community Church in Louisville, Kentucky, Presbyterian Church with Judd Hendricks there as the pastor. I mean, these are some very different very different looking congregational contexts. They all kind of look the same, but they all kind of look different. One thing that I know is that the church of the future is again going to be very, at least when I was in seminary, we like to use the term indigenous. It's going to be a very indigenous kind of organization. It's going to be responsive to its context. I like to say that the open source church celebrates the incarnation by celebrating contextualization. Jesus came in a very specific time and place. The body of Christ now is called to very specific times and very specific places. So the church of the future, that's probably the only thing that I think I can say with certainty, is that the church of the future, you will go from town to town and it will look radically different from where you are given that. What I do know now is I know what I don't want the future of the church to look like. That's about the best that I can get. I was reading an article in Print magazine. It's a graphic designers magazine, and they were talking about the future of design, and he said, we don't even know what we don't want the future of design to look like. So he said, well, I think we should stop and we should take some time and imagine what we don't want it to look like, because he said oftentimes we make the amateur futurist mistake of imagining that tomorrow is simply a better version of today, and he said that oftentimes what we discover is that tomorrow is actually a very different version of today. So when I think about what I don't want the church to look like, I mean, frankly, Chris, I don't want the future of church leadership to look like you and I. I'm tired of white guys in suits. Not that we don't have anything to offer, because thank God we do. But I really want to see people that are more multi-ethnic in the life of leadership in our denominations. When I think of the Presbyterian Church, we are 97% white, middle class. I don't know how that's sustainable. I mean, I really don't. I don't know how we're going to get the full breadth of what God is looking for. So as I look out, that's one of the things that I want to see. I want to stop seeing theology as law or science, as if there isn't a right answer. I want people to start seeing theology as an art form, something that paints a larger picture of who God is. What that eventually looks like, I don't know. I'd like for us to redefine what membership is. I'm on a big crusade against membership, because I think that membership is primarily about cash. That's really all that it is. Reggie McNeil, he wrote a book called Missional Renaissance, which I adore that book. He said typically what churches focus on is how much, how often, and how many. Those are the things that we focus on, and it all really has to do with membership and how much they give and how often they. I want to rediscover what that looks like. Wikipedia doesn't even require that you sign up in order to participate in the life of their community. Is there something that can offer to us? I think that it can, and I think that the last thing that I don't want the church to look like in the future is I want to stop seeing churches operate as centralized social service organizations. I really want to get to the place where we don't need church in order to live out our mission. That's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see us living out our mission in our everyday life. I have a friend, her name is Ann from Louisville. She was talking about this 10 years ago. She said, mission is great and you can go do all, but you know what, I'm going to live my mission. And she intentionally went and sought after job opportunities that allowed her to live out her passion and what she felt like God had called her to do. She specifically wanted to work with poor folk who had problems getting into adequate housing. So as a result, she now works for Habitat for Humanity. It is a perfect match of who she is and what the world needs. But would anybody say that she's doing mission? Not in the classic sense. I don't know that we would, but that's the way that I want to see the future church look like. So, yeah, I know more of what I don't want to see than what I do want to see, unfortunately.
Well, you get closer to it. I mean, would that we all know what we don't want to see. We could avoid some of those things. But the last thing I would like you to kind of elaborate on for us has to do with this idea of not needing the church. Certainly the idea that you can't have God as your father without the church as your mother, that the very witness of a building, to go into a town and to see the largest the highest point being one that was created in hopefully with the sense that we want to touch God, and that a community wants to do that. When we decide that we're going to spend less time with each other, because when I think of church, I don't always think of a building, but of the community. Doesn't that compromise the mission?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if we conceive of it in that way, then absolutely. Yeah, I am asking this question often with pretty much any group that I get in front of, because I want to be provocative, because I want to force us to think about this. What is the purpose of the church now? I mean, Wikipedia knows what its purpose is. I think that our purpose as the church has changed. I don't think we know what it is yet, but I think it has changed. It used to be, a unifying social structure. Honestly, Chris, people don't need us anymore to find community. I mean, this is one of the things that I really was taught through Carol's first book, Tribal Church. We don't need the church anymore in order to form community. People are finding community everywhere. People are finding support. I mean, good work what we would call good pastoral care work. People are finding that outside of the church, and I think that that's fantastic. People are making meaning. Not in the church. Now, a question can be had, we can have the debate as to whether that meaning is as good as the meaning we would give them. I would submit that in many cases it is, and in fact it's better. You also know people that are not a part of the life of a congregation who are better Christians than you and I are. Obviously, something has been done well in the life of the communities that they've done. So what is the purpose of the church? What is the nature of the church? What does it mean to be a part of the church? If all that it means to be a part of the church is that we have a centralized way of doing social service, I want to say that maybe we ought to pack up shop. I want to say that maybe we ought to do something else. I don't know what the church is going to look like. The best that I know is that God still gathers women and men together. There has to be a reason, and I want to find out what that is. I honestly don't know why. Because there were many Sundays where if they didn't pay me, I wouldn't be showing up to church. I mean, it just would not happen. It didn't fulfill. It didn't offer anything to me. I mean, not just as pastor, but through the life of my time as a disciple of Jesus. Yeah, I agree with you. The church is vital. God still is gathering women and men together, but I honestly don't know the reason why anymore. But I think we need to start asking that question to find out why. Because it does things like, what kind of leadership do we need? If we don't know why we're gathering, we don't know what kind of leadership we need. If we don't know why we're gathering, we don't know what we're inviting people into, so it affects evangelism.
Well, I mean, part of what you're saying takes me back to worship, because when I look at our Israelite roots, the idea that I would spend all year growing crops and raising animals, and then it would be highlighted maybe a couple times during the year when I'd pack up the very best that I've got. I would spend a lot of money to get someplace, to get packed in with a bunch of other people, then spend one of those days in line to give my stuff over to somebody who just take it and kill it in front of me or whatever, and then leave. I'm not sure that exercise was meant to give me much self-fulfillment.
Right.
That really, is the right question to ask. Is this something, or is this more? I mean, part of worship is this idea of sacrifice, and that by being together, there's this sense that you and I witness this incredible polarization in our country politics, and people just unable to get along. If we have a community, that we got to work out our differences and make those difficult compromises because of who Christ has been revealed in my life. Isn't it a cop-out to just say we don't, the church isn't doing anything for me, therefore I'm not going to come?
Oh, it absolutely is. And I mean, that's the struggle. That's the struggle, because it's, if we think about a piece of evangelism as being marketing, it's not. But if we think about it like that, it's hard to sell this thing right now. I mean, it really is, because there's just not much worth to it. There's not much value to it. But when you were talking, it reminds me, and I like where you were going, because it reminds me of something that Brian McLaren says a lot, is that we should stop talking about churches as the way we have, and start talking about churches as schools of love. I really like that. I mean, it sounds kind of, it sounds very 16th century romantic, but I think he's on to something, because the church is the one place where we say these divisions, these cannot rule the day. I remember during the last presidential election, my folks were just like everybody else's folks. Some of the Republicans were here and the Democrats were here, and nobody wanted to talk about it. And it was the one day that I kind of went off lectionary, and I preached about Paul and Apollos. And I said, my take on this passage is that polarizing ourselves, identifying ourselves as separate like this, is antithetical to the gospel. So I like your answer, because I think that is probably the truest answer that I've heard thus far. What is the purpose of church? The church it has to be the place where for lack of a better way, it teaches us to get over ourselves in a certain way. That is going to change the way that we do worship, the way that we do evangelism, the way we do Christian education. I really like where you're going with that, honestly.
Well, I don't know if you read much Alain de Botton, the kind of 2.0 atheist who's very popular in Britain right now. He's got Swiss roots, and he has something called the School of Life. And you can go to London, and you can go, and it's Sunday morning, and when you get there, you pay $50 or so because a reporter from The Guardian is going to talk, and you have this wonderful, intellectual experience, and then you have coffee hour where you meet and greet other people who, have the same interests as you do, and the same thing came to me as you were talking about McLaren, because in explaining this to people, and why this was not really resonating with me is because I don't need a school of life, I need a school of love.
Yeah.
I need a place that's going to really challenge me to have love in the center of what I do. Because as atheism grows up, 1.0 was, let's get down on those religious people, they've oppressed us, and let's get rid of them. 2.0 is let's learn from them. You guys have been building community. Actually, you've actually done some good stuff in the last 2,000 years. Maybe we could learn something from you. And so as these kind of secular places pop up, and you and I see them, and they may not be as broad as a school of life and really mimic or mirror some of the things that you and I see in churches, but they are coffee shops where you're having real conversations. Yeah. They are AA meetings where you're having real transformations. They are these gatherings of people who are yearning to have the kind of experiences that church perhaps at one time offered. But many traditional churches have gotten away from. And when you look at vibrant, growing churches, they find a way to incorporate those.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because when you think about love, I've been doing a lot of reading and studying on love. If you take like 1 Corinthians, for example, the famous love chapter, what I realized was that what it means to love is really to learn how to put up with other people. To learn how to tolerate. And I'm wondering, it strikes me that vital churches are churches that are really doing this in earnest, because it doesn't seem like giving up yourself is a really good church growth strategy, right? That doesn't seem like a really good selling point. Hey, you can come and die. That just doesn't seem like it fits to me. But right. These are the places where folks are asking those hard questions and getting into deep relationships with one another and trusting one another in spite of those relationships. Diana Butler Bass's new book, Christianity After Religion, she talks about getting away from the what and getting towards the how, and she talks about relationships. My friends and I have been talking about how it is that we understand being a Christian because of our relationship with one another. I like that, Chris. I like driving down this road, I think.
Take me back then to what you're observing, because your vantage point is different than a lot of other people's. This idea that you brought up of actually kind of leaving established congregations to go through their own cycle and concentrating on founding and starting new churches. What kind of strategies and what kind of skills are you admiring and looking towards when it comes to starting new congregations?
I think that the typical church planters, I think that this is maybe what the Bible might have been talking about when it refers to evangelists. When we talk about Paul, he was the great evangelist. Well, what did he do? He started churches. That's primarily what he did. He went around and did that. You've got to have. I'm admiring people who are much more extroverted than I am. I'm actually a very, very strong introvert. I get worn out in dealing with with a lot of people-y external stuff. So I want to start seeing a lot of people who are very extroverted and just love to gather community. Like one of the best example I can think of is Steve Knight. He works for the Disciples right now. Steve is a perfect example of this kind of person. He just loves people and loves to connect people. I think that people need to naturally have those kinds of gifts and skills. Somebody like me who gets worn out pretty easily with external stimulation, probably not the best church planter out there. Now, I have known some introverts who have done it, and God bless them. They must have a special measure of grace that I don't have. But I think about people like that. I think about people who are good at naming what I call conceptual landmarks. When I was doing research on open source church, one of the things that I discovered was that there was a man named Thomas Schilling, and Thomas Schilling discovered this idea of conceptual landmarks. And when things are decentralized and when things are going in all different directions, what you can do is you can just name certain points for people to kind of keep them all going in the same direction. So like at the congregation that I served, I could say, "We don't choose God," and the congregation would respond, "God chooses us." For us, that was a conceptual landmark. I didn't have to tell them anything else. I just had to kind of name some of those. So people who can discern and name and creatively proclaim those creative landmarks, I think, or conceptual landmarks, I think, are necessary. We need to have people who are good at facilitating meetings. I mean, honestly, I think probably the best skill set that any person involved with a church can learn is how to facilitate a small group. And it doesn't take, you asked me a while ago, is leadership something learned? I think it is. It doesn't take a whole lot to recognize that somebody's eyes are glazing over and you're boring them to tears. It doesn't take a whole lot to realize that extrovert has talked a lot and that introvert has been sitting there with something to say, and so making it that person can come in. I also think about being probably the last skill set that I can think of is we have to be more like John the Baptist rather than Jesus. John the Baptist the reason why we revere this man is because he very famously said, "There is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." He lost disciples to this guy, right, as he's walking along the road. Are we willing to look at people and say, "I see things in you that you may not see yourself"? Are we willing to mentor people into the life of faith, into the life of leadership? Are we willing to look at people and say, "There is something inside of you that you may not even see yet, but I'm going to help you pull that thing out"? I can't think of anything more that I would. When I think about the times in my life, the people that I hold up as kind of the saints in my life, that's what they've done for me. They are the people who've kind of set me down. I had one elder at the congregation sit me down and basically tell me to quit whining and crying like a baby because I had what it takes and I needed to step up. That to me was a leader of the church, and I have to think that the future church would need something like that. People who are planting these new churches to go out and to affirm people and to say, "You've got this gift. I say that God has put it into you, but you've got this gift, and there must be some reason that you have it. There must be some purpose for this really special, unique gift and skill that you have. Hey, come over here to this really freaky little collective we've got, and let's try to figure this thing out." Those are some of the things that I want to see in these future these church planters.
Okay. A lot of people who view and who read this blog, Landon, are congregational leaders, and we take our spiritual lives seriously. How we devote ourselves to God, how we engage in practices, and I'm wondering what open source would have to say to especially those of us from liturgical traditions, those of us who who have personal spiritual practices that are defined a certain way. How might we look at those, and perhaps how has your own personal spiritual life been changed as you've gone through these concepts?
One of the things that it's done for me personally, and that I would hope that it would do for a lot of people, is that it has allowed me to investigate and explore other practices that are not. Presbyterians are kind of famous for being locked onto Scripture, and that's just about it. If it doesn't have to do with...
We lost our Skype signal momentarily. Okay. There. You began to say, "I'm sorry." It's allowed you to.
It's allowed me to explore and investigate other practices that are not specifically tied to my tradition. Like I was saying, the Presbyterian Church is very, very locked on the Word, the written Word, the Bible. if it doesn't spring forth from the Word, then it's just not it's just not the best thing ever. But I've discovered that there are a lot of faithful Christians who, while they revere the Bible and use it to guide and allow it to transform their life, perhaps there are some other spiritual practices that are not based specifically in the Word. So as a result, one of the things that I have done as of late is I pray the Anglican prayer beads. That's sure, a case can be made that those prayers are founded in the Scriptures, and I think so. But I'm not wrestling and meditating with a passage of Scripture like in a daily prayer sort of way. I'm just putting my thumb and my forefinger on some beads, and I'm saying some prayers, and I'm allowing God to work on me. For a long time, I was a student of centering prayer, Thomas Keating, centering prayer. I've dabbled even in Zen meditation. I think for a lot of us, what it allows us to do is allow us to go into some of those different places, because the open source notion is that there is good all over the place, and there's not just one way to do this. There's good all over the place. Like I would tell the youth in confirmation class, if it's good, it's God. I mean, that's just the way to think about it. If it's life-giving, if it's transformative, if it helps you get over yourself, it's God. And so why not take part in it? I understand some people who get frustrated by that because they like a lot of consistency. I typically am one of those kinds of people in life. That's why I make a very good Presbyterian, because I like for B to follow A. That's just the way that I like it to do. But the world is just a little too messy for that right now, and I think that this gives us some permission to search out this new way of being, because if the church could keep going the way it always has, then we wouldn't be in the predicament that we're in. So why not do some exploring?
Well, Landon Whitsitt, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us about open source church, and certainly about your very helpful observations about congregational life these days. Thanks for being with me on ChurchNext.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.